Hello, I'm John Matisonn. Welcome to the forum where we ask what it'll take to get South Africa back on the road to more jobs and a more equal society. Today I'm talking to Democratic South Africa's longest serving leader of the opposition, Tony Leon. He has a new book out, his fifth book. It's called Future Tense, Reflections on My Troubled Land. Tony, welcome to the forum.
Thank you, John. Nice to be with you again.
Tony, you've done interesting things since you left politics. You spent time at Harvard University, you were ambassador in Argentina, you've been in business. You also led the Democratic Alliance panel looking at what went wrong with the DA in the last few years. Before we discuss our politics, as a South African who's traveled and seen the world, I wanted to get a bit of your worldview, what you've learned. You seem to think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you seem to think that the ANC government is fundamentally naive about the world, that it's interested, you say, for instance, that the world is a hyper-competitive and self-interested place, whereas the ANC doesn't seem to appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And of course, you yourself are a distinguished international affairs columnist on News 24, which I read your stuff with great interest. Yeah, chapter in my new book is actually called In the Losers League, Friends Without Benefits, because really most of our foreign policy, to the extent we have one, is really about litigating the past. And it's based on victimology. It's based on the being on the wrong side of the Cold War, if you were, because of the side the ANC backed actually lost. But all that's history. I mean, nothing really matters so much as, what your current and future propositions are. And in this regard, I just see this incredible, again and again, shooting our country in the foot by our political lords and masters. And I sketch some examples of this, the amazing démarche or political line of action that Durko decided to dish up to 5 Western countries who actually were simply answering a call from Cyril Ramaphosa's own investment envoys as to what was holding up investment in the country, and they gave an answer, and then they were hauled in for a drubbing at the Durko headquarters. And then I had an interaction with one of those 5 ambassadors of leading invest nations who found the thing quite incredible, if not stupid.
The démarche was because they had complained about corruption, as I recalled.
Yes, and a few other investment blocking aspects such as BEE, and this was, at the request of the investment envoys themselves. And then there was this juvenile diatribe from the ANC, in addition to the Durko démarche, where the ANC basically said, we're not going to be dictated to by colonizing countries such as Switzerland, which is a bit of a joke because they've never colonized anyone. But, and I wrote in the book, I said, a first-year international relations student wouldn't have written that, or would at least have known that Switzerland is not a colonizer of any sort under history. So you have that, and then you have when Gwedi Mantashe was the Secretary General, they banned Western envoys from attending the ANC policy conference. And then numerous examples of spurning Israel's offer of water technology here, but going to Iran to get water technology, or they have no track record in that regard. Whereas ideology, so I guess a big theme of my book, and it permeates everything, domestic politics and our international outlook, is based on ideology. And that ideology is not only outdated, but I think in many cases is counterproductive, John.
Now, specifically, one of the things that interested me, you said that China, who's seen as a strong ANC government ally, is actively assisting in the deindustrialization of South Africa. That's not something I think that you hear from people in government.
No, but it is so. And I mean, ironically, the it's not so much what the government says, what the government does. I mean, the textile saga is well known. You just have to go to Salt River and look at all those shuttered factories. And I'm not a protectionist, but, there's no doubt that cheap Chinese imports, flooded the market here. They were on an uncontrolled basis. And now you've seen something very similar in the steel industry in this country. And so the government, on the one hand, votes with China and every international council. On the other hand, they introduce walls of tariffs very late in the day to try and keep those cheap imports out. But, so China might be a big trading partner and might be an ideological ally, but China is doing this country no favors because China looks after its own interests. And really, I guess the thesis of Future Tense, my book, is you need a government that actually looks after the country interests, not some ideological obsessions that date back to the 1960s.
I wanted to take one more example from your book. You mentioned that the South African ambassador to Venezuela sent our soldiers, said that we would send soldiers to fight the Americans. That's just quite bizarre that an ambassador of South Africa wouldn't know what the US military would do to South African soldiers. There'd be carnage.
Well, absolutely. And John, there's another very fine book out at the moment on the debacle of South Africa's military intervention in the Central African Republic, the Battle of Bangui. We can't fight in Bangui. You're certainly not going to be able to take on the US military's fighters. But just the crazy town stuff that Mr. Nkosi, I think was his name, was mouthing. I said he put some moron back into oxymoron. It just was extraordinary. Now, admittedly, to be fair, he was reprimanded, but he's still in post. I mean, but that's Hugo Chavez's Venezuela, which is an inspiration as indeed under Maduro, and the fact also in the same section of the book that Maduro, who has turned his country into a state of beggary. It was the richest country in South America a decade or two back. That while people were eating their own pets to survive, Ramaphosa was busy tweeting how he'd enjoyed this conversation with his brother leader Maduro. And you've got to say to yourself, who is this aimed at? It might be aimed at some tiny constituency inside the ANC chattering classes, but it does our country no favors as a credible international partner. And you will know this because you very much have been front and center of chronicling it. At the point of accession of Nelson Mandela as president in 1994, the world was at South Africa's feet. We were one of the most admired countries in the world. Everyone was, beating a quick path to the door of the South African president. And today we've just kind of joined the ranks of the third world, also ran countries, and we seem perfectly happy to remain there. And whatever one's predispositions might be, if your international posture doesn't actually align with your domestic needs, then you're not doing yourself any favors, particularly the amount of money that is poured in by the grateful and unsuspecting South African taxpayer into our foreign missions abroad, and the results are absolutely dismal.
Now, just to position you correctly, you were not for Donald Trump because your former speechwriter Joel Pollak and his mother-in-law, who's very well known in Cape Town, Rhoda Kodali, they moved to America and they've gone all in for Trump. But my sense from your book is that you haven't followed them.
No. Look, let me just put it out there. I'm very fond of Joel Pollak. He was a great speechwriter, but he and I do not agree on American politics these days. But there it is.
You basically see Trump as a danger to the democratic system, and I don't want to put words in your mouth.
That is correctly my position. I think he was an abomination. I think he was a terrible president, and he was voted out. Having said all that, and what the events in America in January, the storming the Capitol, were just staggering. But John, having said all that, I think there is an enormous amount of self-correction in the American political system, or constitutional system. The fact is that Trump, who had the most powerful office in the world, which is, I think, correctly the factual description of anyone who's president of the United States, he actually couldn't prevail. He couldn't subvert the election results. He couldn't extend his whole office. He couldn't, bend the Supreme Court of the United States to his will with the lawsuits that he brought.
Right.
So in fact, although it was severely tested, that system proved to be very robust. And, I wish we could say the same about our own system, because it's obviously much more fragile and much more recent, the American system. But I actually have seen recent events in America, not just the ousting of Trump democratically, but all that went with it, is actually very healthy as a democratic check and balance.
Well, this brings us to Biden. Joe Biden, as president, has started what we considered massive government intervention to correct things he feels the markets have got wrong. Wouldn't that be against the policy of the Democratic Alliance that you led?
Well, we're pretty free market, but we were always in favor of, state support for those who couldn't get by in the system. I mean, we were a party that favored the basic income grant long before others did in this country.
I remember that.
Happened. Yeah. But we did it in a fiscally responsible way. So we said, well, the fiscus can do more things, can give firepower to people who are poor, marginalized, and excluded, but there's going to be a cost to it. And this is how the cost will be met. And we had you'll remember very well from your days as the independent political editor, when independent newspapers were in fact independent, long ago and far away, that Ken Andrew, who was, a very thoughtful chap, who was the finance spokesman of the DP and then the DA, everything was costed. We said, well, actually, if you do this, we've got to privatize a whole range of state-owned companies to pay for it. And we've got to do certain things to the tax system. And we've got to increase that by a certain percentage. So it will be paid for. It's not going to just be, a populist magic money tree. So I think, the state can and should intervene, as indeed states are doing everywhere in the world, particularly in this under coronavirus economics or COVID economics, under this plague we're suffering under. But I think it's got to be done in a sustainable and responsible way. And also, it can't crowd out the private sector, because if the state just assumes too big a role, then that's what happens. But I think in the United States, the free market remains that. It is very still the engine that drives growth in America. And all the subventions in the latest relief bill that's gone through, it's gone through the Senate. I don't know if it's going to pass muster with the left-wing forces in the House of Representatives. That's still to be seen. Is proof of that.
We must take a break. We'll be back with Tony Leon in a moment. And we're back talking to Tony Leon. Tony, I must say I found what you're saying about Biden interesting, because I find the Biden administration quite exciting, regardless of Biden's past, what people say about the history and so on. He's seen that he has a moment where a lot needs to be done. And he's going to be changing, if he gets his way, he's going to be bringing a lot of infrastructure. He's also going to be bringing green technology. And if he gets what he wants, it's going to change the energy system around the world. And he's doing, of course, partly because of climate change. This will have enormous implications for South Africa too. I don't know if you agree with what he's doing, but also the question then is South Africa ready? Because we're going to have to make electric cars, and we're not doing that yet. We're going to need to think of a very different kind of energy system.
Oh, absolutely. Look, it's clearly it's going to happen. I mean, it's happening in Europe. It's likely to happen, you say, under Joe Biden, who's not a climate denialist. And there's just worldwide pressure. I mean, probably no one, if you talk about the power of civil society, then David Attenborough has done more to draw the world's attention to how imperiled we are as a species and our planet. So, I think that change is happening. And I completely agree. The economic life force are changing all the time. The days of the petrol car are going to be numbered. And we're going to live under revolution. Look, got big implications for South Africa. Leaving aside the fact that we've yet to actually agree on alternative energy being put onto our national grid. I mean, theoretically agreed, it's been spoken about for 2 years, it hasn't actually happened.
Right.
So let's just take two big, for examples from that, John. Number one, we have coal-fired power stations in this country. They are not sustainable, even though there's an enormous number of people who work on them. There's a huge amount of investment in them. There's a lot of vested interests around them. Gwedi Mantashe personifying that. Well, that's not sustainable going forward. Number two, precisely because of the change of technologies, and technologies just change, as you know better than most, so quickly, we're going to be in a situation where we thought, we had this fantastic minerals treasure trove, and yet the world is going to be looking at other things like cobalt, which is going to be hugely important going forward because it provides the source of batteries for electric cars. And right. South Africa's, platinum offer, which is fantastic for catalytic converter car in motor cars, is going to be redundant in about a few years' time. So it's got all kinds of challenges for South Africa. And, I don't express much confidence because, as I say, our economics, our policies drawn from a playbook from the 1950s and 60s, that we're going to meet it. But, if I might just quote from the book for 1 second, I do at the end of it have a section borrowed from Star Wars called, warp speed changes everything. And, it's this remarkable moment that in the fag end of the tricameral parliament, which I was a junior backbencher in 1993, I go to a committee presentation by the then Minister of Telecommunications, Dr. Pete Velgemoot, and he's talking about the cell phone that's going to be introduced into South Africa the following year. We'd never seen cell phones, these big bricks that arrived, as you recall, in 1994. Right. And he said this was the government's best estimate because no one knew how do you put a figure on something that you don't know. He said, well, between 500,000 and 900,000 South Africans will get cell phones. Well, as I point out, there are now 100 million SIM cards in the country today. Right. And that's only 27 years after that prediction was made. So, just the rapid change of technology, the speed at which it upends everything is the one constant that we know in a very inconstant world. And the government can have all the plans, it can regulate as much as it wants to regulate, but these economic life forms are just going to escape their control as they are doing now.
Well, you have something in your book which I searched for just before I came on. I couldn't quite find it, but you refer to an expert says it's easy to get growth. And of course it is in a sense, but it's a little bit disarming because he says, you quote him saying something like, you just have to find the opportunities and support them. But of course that begs the question where there are real opportunities. And I suppose the trick for government is to recognize the directions like they did with the cell phone, and then not try to assume how really big it's going to get. That is determined in the market.
Yeah, that quote in the book actually comes from one of the commentaries on the Spence Commission for Growth. Well, I mean, they looked at the 20 how many countries that sustained 7 to 10% GDP growth over a period of time and said, well, this was as they say in Afrikaans, dit was die wenrecept. This is what they did. And as that commentator said, who I quote in the book, basically said, it's not some great mystery out there as to what constitutes economic growth. It's allowing people to, exploit the opportunities that are available to them, not get in the way of them and fashion your policy around that. And to an extent, not entirely, and I want to be critical of it, the first iteration of the National Development Plan, when Trevor Manuel was in charge of the Planning Commission, was pretty sensible. I mean, you can argue about some of the stuff, but it was, but basically here's the thing, John, it predicated the future by 2030, that we'd be enjoying 5.3% GDP growth per annum and by doing certain things and having a future-oriented policy, not one looking through the rearview mirror. And one of my former colleagues, who's now the finance MEC in the Western Cape, David Mania, pointed out to me at some coffee clutch we had one Saturday morning that simply if we'd achieved 5.3% growth, and we're now, less than 1% this year and declining or going up, it's all pretty bottom-feeding stuff, then within 14 years, we would double the GDP per capita, which is, a reasonable, not an accurate indicator of economic well-being for ordinary people. At the rate we're going now, it's going to take 75 years to achieve the same target, which is, God knows what will happen between now and 75 years' time. And so I am very skeptical that the government, other than producing plans, or as Greg Mills says in the Brenthurst Foundation, we are policy rich and implementation poor, because the other running theme in my book and yours, indeed, Cyril's choices, is that you have a state which is commanding more and more control over the economy. And yet because of the policies that have been pursued and are pursued as we speak this evening, John, you and I, right now, the actual back of the state has been broken. So you've got a broken backed state that demands more and more control. And that's just an inherent contradictory situation.
Yes, as I think I referred in my book, I mean, the things that we know work. I mean, the data is very clear. If we did a digital migration promptly and opened up the spectrum, those are all doable things and not expensive, but every minister promises it and doesn't deliver it. And of course, also, if we handled mining, not necessarily, I mean, you don't, you might argue for less BEE than I might, but the fact is what mining houses want more than no BEE is certainty that whatever policy you come with, you stick to long enough so that they know their investment is secure. Those things would create jobs and growth quite immediately, but we just can't, the government just can't get its act together to do them.
Absolutely. And, I'm in favor of BE. It depends how you direct it. I think disadvantaged people should be advantaged. I don't think Baleka Mbete, my nemesis, who was parliamentary speaker, but actually ANC hack-in-chief or hackette, was given 25 million rand for her mining expertise as part of that Southfield thing. It's extraordinary how the system it's basically opened the floodgates to corruption. That's what the current system has done. And you can wail against corruption, but if you don't actually take on the legal system that enables it, then you're on a hiding to nothing. But the interesting thing to me, John, is let's just deal with mining, which I do deal with in my book. The extraordinary thing with whether the policies change and the mining charters, mining court process, is the basic administrative incompetence of the Department of Mineral Resources. Obviously, the exceptions, there are some good people there. So these mining licenses get held up forever and a day, prospecting licenses, whatever the policy might be, that is one thing we can have an argument about. But you actually want efficiency, corruption-free delivery, and you don't get it in key state departments. And no investor is going to actually say, well, you're doing us a favor by allowing us to invest in your country. They simply take the deal book somewhere else, as indeed they're doing. They vote with their feet. And that's been a repeated point made by Fruneman, who's the boss of Sibanye, one of our successful mining companies, and the fact that Anglo Gold, which was a mining iteration of Anglo American, last year exited this country completely.
And I find it disturbing, as I'm sure you do, that you don't hear from the government. You don't hear the government stepping in forcefully, wringing their hands and saying, what did we do wrong? What do we need to fix?
No, you don't hear that. They will find someone to blame. I mean, let's take something that is of huge concern to every one of us, all of us, particularly those of us in our age cohort, Mr. Matisonn, the lack of vaccinations in this country. I mean, it is incredible, having known from a year ago, last April, just on a year ago, that vaccines were being developed, and there was in fact, the program was called Operation Warp Speed, to coin a phrase in the United States. And Bibi Netanyahu, the ultimate political kind of operator, had 17 phone calls with the CEO of Pfizer, and so got Israel, all the vaccines it needed, and now has the world-beating vaccine record of all countries in the world. And our blokes just sat on their hands and did nothing until January this year. And now we're scrambling around, blaming everyone else. It's fundamental government malpractice. And yet, they want to control things. Well, look after the citizens, look after their health, look after their security. That's what people want governments to do before you start on a whole richer agenda of things you think government should do.
Yes, and Israel's Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu often thought of as an opportunist. I mean, this could well get him re-elected despite everything, because that's something that voters want.
I wrote about that, John. It might be an arch opportunist, but opportunists go where the opportunities are. And, motive, when it comes to people's health and survival, so you say, well, the Prime Minister has a bad motive. I promise you the result is much more important than the motive. So Cyril piously proclaiming that, it's unfair that the rich countries are hoarding vaccines. Yes, he's probably correct. But, moaning about it instead of doing something about it is not the way to make your population safe and secure.
Tony, we need to take another break. We'll be right back with Tony Leon. and we're back talking to Tony Leon. His new book is Future Tense. Tony, I don't want to spend too much time on this because there's a lot more to cover, but just comparing SAA with Ethiopian Airways, I mean, I found it so astonishing. I mean, I felt that the ANC government tried to do the right thing in the early days. They got in an American expert, Coleman Andrews. He turned out not to be the right man, but I thought that they were sincere at that time in trying to solve it. What did Ethiopian Airways do right that SAA did wrong?
Well, yeah, I spent a chapter in my book dealing with SAA because I had a lot of direct experience of them, both at the CEO level and also working for their cause in South America, a difficult place to do aviation business, as I chronicle. And what Ethiopian Airways basically did was to get aviation experts to run the airline. I think I quote a figure there that the top management of Ethiopian Airlines had hundreds of years of aviation experience among the top tier. I don't think South African Airways has had an aviation expert in the seat since my dear friend, the late Chris Smythe, was acting CEO, one of about 12 under Dudu Mayeni's reign of error or terror, as I chronicle.
But that's what they thought they were doing with Coleman Andrews, the American.
Yeah, well, Coleman took them for a ride, of course, as I do chronicle how he did that with a very profitable scheme, which was hugely beneficial to him. And Saki Makazoma, who was the CEO of Transnet at the time, was just completely naive and out of his depth, which goes to the point of cadre deployment.
It was really unfortunate because it set such a bad precedent. And now, of course, many people are justifiably skeptical about bringing in an American expert.
Yeah, so absolutely. Although he was very good at business, Coleman Andrews, he was most successful looking after his own business.
Yeah.
But leaving aside him as a personality, I mean, and leaving aside the utter corruption, malignancy, misconduct of Dudu Mayeni, it is incidentally extraordinary to me, as we are speaking tonight, John, that she was at the receiving end of the most devastating judgment ever visited, in my view, in my opinion, as I expressed in the book, by a High Court Judge, Renel Tolme, last year, after ARTA and the pilots brought a delinquency action against her. And the judge in question invited the National Prosecuting Authority to consider criminal charges against Dudu Mayeni, and they haven't yet happened. And this is now, we're talking, that was last May, nothing. Yeah. So, you must draw your own conclusions from that. But more materially, there were other problems with SAA. I mean, one of them is that the problem with a state-owned airline, which Ethiopians basically avoided completely, is it kept, in South Africa's case, being saddled with a so-called development agenda. You've got to have so many pilots who are this. You've got to fly these routes that are staggeringly uncompetitive. Now, Ethiopian Airways, as I understand it, not only has aviation experts, doesn't get money from the government, but basically follows its own commercial imperative. So it runs a profitable airline. And, obviously everything changed under COVID because every airline's now suffered. But it was interesting to me, although they went into temporary bankruptcy from which they've happily emerged, that for 71 years until last year, Comair was posting a profit. And, South African Airways, was, staggeringly received 50 billion rand of government bailouts over 20 plus years. And it was insolvent at the point it was taken over by the business rescue practitioners. So I don't believe states should control airlines, but if they do, for whatever reason, they've got to let the airline determine its own course of action, not keep interfering, not just in the management, not just in the in the routes of the airline, but in the operations of the airline as well.
Right. I want to move to closer to South African politics. First of all, you refer to polling that shows that the great emphasis on land reform that comes from the ANC and the EFF, of course, the Economic Freedom Fighters, is not reflected in what voters want. As I understood it, you were saying that your polling shows that only 1% of people make land reform their top need. Much higher come the two issues of jobs and education.
Yeah, it's not, well, that's a poll done once a year by the Institute of Race Relations. And, I think that's entirely accurate in the sense that, most South Africans are urbanized. I think the figure of urbanization in this country is very high. It's about 65%. So and land reform is largely, not entirely, aimed at rural areas. So I think there's an inverse relationship in South Africa between what ordinary people express themselves about and what the government priorities are. Again and again, we see that. And, you know, it is jobs and education, or education jobs, because if you have a good education and you have decent qualification, you're liable to get a job, even in an economically depressed situation. You're more liable to get a job, and you're more liable to have the skills to operate in the country and the world than if you don't have that. And that's why, you know, we know, not just in our own history, but throughout history and throughout the world, that people want their children to have decent education. And the one thing that we haven't provided our children in this country with is decent education. I mean, I quote from, and this is from 12 years ago, but it's just got much worse. I was on a panel that the Sunday Times convened at Constitutional Hill in 2008, and Mampela Rampili and Wendy Luhabi, who are very prominent voices in the society and in commerce and business, both basically said that Bantu education was better than the government education of under the ANC, which is an extraordinary statement. Now, you and I couldn't say that, John, because we weren't the victims of Bantu education. But when two prominent South African black women who were educated under Bantu education, but who have since gone outside of its confines, make that comment, then you should sit up and take notice. And the educational outcomes in this country are disastrous. And that is in part because we've allowed a public sector union, SADTU, to have an absolute iron grip over the education system in the government schooling system itself.
Now, you say in your book that South Africa's politics, which is need to change to fix it, are in a catch-22. You're, I suppose, pessimistic that things will change, that this kind of policy freeze or implementation freeze will be broken until the ANC splits, and that the DA, let's just start there. And you argue that countries like Israel and India, which also had liberation movements that became governments, lasted roughly 30 years in those two cases before they broke down and later became really small fringe parties.
Yeah, well, let me start with the last point. It is fascinating because, I mean, we sit in South Africa and think we're somehow unique, but of course, other countries have been one-party dominant systems, like the Israel under the Labour Party and India under Congress and Mexico under the RPI. And it wasn't just that those parties controlled the government or the parliament, they controlled the whole of society. I mean, I recount the story, Ariel Sharon, who formed the Likud party, was a famous soldier, said you couldn't get promoted beyond the rank of brigadier in the Israel Defense Force. You didn't have a Labour Party membership card. So cadre deployment is not unique to South Africa. But eventually, those parties were thrown out, and they've never recovered their previous mojo or their dominance of those countries. So I think that is a cause of optimism. I don't know, of course, what replaces this government. And you and I, John, grew up under the National Party, which was an equal hegemon, which seems that it would rule forever. And, you know, in one election, it went from being this mighty party to a 20% party. In the next election, 7%. The election after that, it ceased to exist. So once again, warp speed speeds up all these processes of democratic change. So I think that is a matter of hope. But back to the catch-22, as I define it, you know, to misquote the great Joseph Heller, catch-22 is where escape from a situation is impossible because of the inherent contradictions in the problem itself. And that, to me, is a really apt description of where the ANC is. So to change this country, to get the growth, the jobs, the decent outcomes that everyone knows are required, will mean that we need pro-growth policies, we need economic growth, we need investment, none of which has happened. And instead of making those changes that would bring that, which would require policy changes, we are now spending 20 cents of every rand paying off the government debt. Just servicing that debt, not paying it off. That's just the interest, not the principal. And, you know, it's interesting, when I started this book at the end of 2019, we were paying R1 billion a day in our government's interest bill. When I finished the book at the end of last year, John, had gone up to R2 billion. Now, that's not sustainable. But you see, reform will only happen, whether it's the ANC splits or the ANC reforming itself, doesn't really matter, if it's prepared to go on a different path. But that would mean disuniting the party. And there was this really, I thought, pusillanimous statement of Ramaphosa last year where he said, well, I would rather, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is the essence of what he said, I'd rather be remembered as a person, as a weak president, than as a person who presided over the disunity of the ANC. So if you preference the party over the country and over the choices it has to make, then you're never going to get out of that catch-22 trap.
Before we go to the break, I just want to quote, I thought an interesting insight in your book. You referred to the breakaway parties, and the breakaway parties from the liberation movement, from the ANC, seem to end in narcissistic ego clashes and policy incoherence. Explain that.
Well, I was actually in Washington on a fellowship in 2007, 2008, I beg your pardon, when Coke broke away from the ANC. And I wrote an article, it was very difficult to get published on the op-ed page of the Washington Post, and they accepted it after 200 revisions, because I said, this Coke, which was led by Mosia Lakota, who'd been the chairman of the ANC, and Mbazima Shilowa, who'd been the premier of the Gauteng, and many other worthies in the ANC, was the biggest and most significant breakaway from the ANC since the formation of the PAC, which had been in the late 1950s. And I said, because this is a real deal changer. And of course, we know what happened. They'd surged in the next election. There became a factionalized fighting between the two leadership groups. The party, and I really like Terry Lakota. I think he's a man of great integrity and decency. But the party, I think, has got 3 seats in parliament because it couldn't get its act together. And, the leaders fell out. And, I could go through practically every... the DeLille's various breakaways, from all disintegrate into tiny factions, though she's done quite well out of it herself. And, it's just extraordinary. So I don't think that unless there's some massive reformulation of the opposition in a coherent way, it's actually going to really be a deal changer.
Tony, we have to make our last break. We'll be right back with Tony Leon. And we're back talking to Tony Leon, whose latest book is Future Tense. Tony, this brings us to the opposition. I suppose that what we were just talking about how the new parties, breakaway parties, don't survive. I suppose something similar is likely to happen to both Mmusi Maimane and Herman Mashaba, who had really powerful positions in the DA. And I wonder if they appreciated what they were giving up, going outside and trying to start on their own.
Yes, well, look, I mean, Mashaba's path is clear, even though we have a few choice things to say about each other in our respective books. Maimane's is fairly incoherent because I don't actually know what his movement is doing. Mashaba started another political party, I don't know if it's number 46 or number 47, crowding the ballot paper, but he clearly is going to, eat away at some DA support. I don't think Mmusi Maimane is starting a political party, he's doing something else. But it's very hard. I mean, one of the reasons, and you were eyewitness to that there was such a terrible fight inside the DA when I was a leader and Martinus van Schalkwyk was the deputy, and then he broke away again and he tried to reconstitute the National Party. Why we hung on with grim determination for DA was because the infrastructure was so important. The actual, not just the brand, but the organization, the machinery, the members. And, it was a very difficult time. I describe it as marriage made in hell in my other book, On the Contrary. But if you look at the results, however much the DA might have suffered somewhat, it's a coherent party. It controls a province. It controls dozens of municipalities. But it wouldn't have happened in the absence of a political machine. So that political machinery really does count. And so does the brand. Even the brand is a bit battered and tattered. It still registers in people's minds when they have to make their crosses.
Now, in your book, the new book, you do talk about what went wrong, because you chaired this panel of 3 that investigated, was invited by the leader. I'm sorry, you were one of the 3 members of the panel that was asked by Mmusi Maimane to investigate why the DA did badly in 2019, its first reduction since democracy. And you explained there that you were asked to give Mmusi Maimane a private briefing on what you were going to say. And once you did that, things went haywire and really in a very damaging way to the DA.
Yes, well, look, those two chapters, two of the 16 chapters deal with the DA saga. And they, perhaps for those who are interested, it really does lift the lid, not in a sensationalist way, but because there was so much disinformation about what was going on, and so many outright, pork pies or lies were told about what was happening there. I just really felt the strong need to set the record straight. And this book does that by just lifting the lid on some of that. And it was extraordinary that we were really earnestly requested, beseeched might be the best word, by Mmusi to go to his office and share with him our findings before we'd made them known to the party. And I was a bit reluctant because I thought this is all going to land up in some place. And immediately after we'd met with him and shared our findings, preliminary findings with him, he started phoning around the party, suggesting that we were calling for the heads of, half a dozen major leaders. In fact, one head we were calling for was his. Yeah. And, creating a cast of imaginary fellow victims was a way of trying to disable the report. In fact, the report was accepted by an overwhelming majority at a party federal council meeting a few weeks later, and the rest of that is history. So, we didn't write our own terms of reference. I mean, he signed off on them. We didn't appoint ourselves. He appointed us. But, if you appoint a committee and you of independent-minded people, you ask them to do something, one of the criteria that you've signed off on is that you should investigate the capacity of the leadership, and you're the leader of the party when you just preside over its worst election result and its history in terms of its losses, then you've got to take your lumps. Well, I think tried to be disingenuous, and I don't do that because he's actually, as I do also mention, he's a very nice man with many strong qualities. But leadership is not just about presenting well on TV.
Well, just one specific question before we move on. The Patricia de Lille saga just seemed to go on endlessly. How would you have done it differently if you'd been leader at the time?
Well, because it's far easier to be critical than to be correct, to misquote Disraeli. I mean, I had done it. I mean, I was, in 2001, I fired the mayor of Cape Town. His name was Peter Marais, because he was doing a lot of damage to the DA brand then, a long time ago. So we seem to have an issue sometimes with mayors. And, we even lost a court case against him. But the whole thing from beginning to end took 6 weeks. So it did some damage, but the party moved on. This went on for 18 months. Oh, I think there were calamitous mistakes made in that. It's probably, ancient history. I mean, the DA kept changing the narrative. What was it? I mean, it was so bad that 2 weeks before election day, John, my wife turned around to me, and I had some knowledge, and I've been out campaigning for the party in the 2019 election. She said, "Tell me, Tony, what exactly is Patricia de Lille deemed to have done? Right. Please answer." And I couldn't answer the question 2 weeks before polling day. Well, I can assure you, most DA voters couldn't. So not only did they botch it, and I deal with that in the book, but it dragged on and on, as you point out, and then they couldn't explain it in a coherent way. But the other thing that really surprised me, because I raised this with two of the head honchos of the party, the CEO and the chief strategist, who'd taken me out to a very nice liquid lunch to persuade me to go and campaign for the DA in the 2019 elections. And I said, I keep picking up this response about Patricia de Lille and what it's done to the party brand. And they sat there blithely under the oaks in Constantia and said to me, "Oh, no, it was a big problem last year. We've put it all behind us. Our polling shows that we've got back to where we were." Well, the real polls, which were in a few weeks' time, showed something else. And I have no doubt, because, when I did limited campaign appearance to the party, everywhere I went, even in Joburg, where I did a lot of campaigning, and in Pretoria, people kept raising that question. Because I think what it did was and I'm not talking about the merits of what Patricia de Lille did or didn't do, it completely undermined the party's claim to clean administration and efficiency.
Yeah. So this year should be an exciting year in politics because there are local elections. And I had an earlier iteration of this show a lot during the last local elections. And at that time, there was an air of excitement and engagement. A lot of ANC elders came on my show to denounce Zuma and corruption, and went to varying degrees in saying that this has got to change, there's an urgency. This time, there seems to be an opportunity being wasted. What do you think is going to happen, and why are we not seeing more excitement about a potentially game-changing election?
Well, you know, Ken Livingston, the one-time controversial mayor of London, wrote a book called "If Voting Changed Anything, They Would Abolish It." I mean, you know, I some truth in that as well. I guess people feel a bit let down because there's a huge amount of excitement, not just in the election last time, but the results. I mean, here was the ANC had been toppled from power. It was unimaginable. I recount in the book, I had this conversation with Jeff Khadebi, who's a veteran ANC cabinet minister, a few weeks before the last local elections. And he said to me, and I mean, it wasn't said boastfully, it seemed entirely correct. He said, we've got problems in PE, we've got problems in Pretoria, but Johannesburg is safe for us. And I thought, yeah, it is. And of course, they lost Johannesburg in that election. And then, of course, everything happened, which happened since 2016, not just DA, but in those administrations. And people think, well, you know, actually, we thought it was all going to happen and nothing happened, or it didn't happen what we thought should happen. But look, I mean, I don't know how the electorate is going to react. I don't know what the effect of this absolutely shattered economy is going to be on people's voting, whether they vote at all, and whether they vote for the opposition. I think the opposition can still make a strong case. I mean, it's not for me to make it anymore. My successors have to do that. Because, you know, whatever you and I might think, you know, of this, how Cape Town, the Western Cape is run, it is incontestably better, even on its worst day, than the best day of an ANC-administered city, whether it's Johannesburg, where potholes are now the size of craters in the moon, or Durban, which is, you know, got corrupt mayor now on criminal charges for, you know, milking the 400 million rand process in a corrupt way. And, you know, you can go through and Nelson and East London, where the mayor of the time stole the Nelson Mandela, you know, funeral fund. It is extraordinary. So, you know, even if the DA doesn't shoot the lights out where it governs, it doesn't steal the money. And it basically, if you have a blocked drain, where I live in the Cape Town suburbs, they come in about 40 minutes call, and they come at 10 o'clock at night to unblock it. So there are things to be grateful for. And if the DA can make a compelling case, I think it's got a fighting chance. But look, that's a what if, and we'll have to see, John.
We have 2 minutes left. So my last question to you, I think you've given a bit of thought to this. What is going to be the long-term impact of the COVID-19 pandemic for South Africa?
Oh, I think it's huge. And I think it's largely negative. But look, it might create new economic life forms here. It has created an alternative economy, you know, and I know we're speaking on a medium, John, that I wasn't aware of a year ago, and probably you weren't either.
No,
maybe you were. And now Zoom is well, that's obviously an American company. Zoom is, you know, market capitalization is greater than the top 6 airlines in the world, which is not surprising. But you just take home deliveries. I mean, just look at Take-A-Lot, how that soared. Look at Woolworths, Checkers, deliver your groceries in 60 minutes. It didn't exist, you know, a year ago. So, you know, I think that can be a positive. The negative is, can we ever recover all the lost ground in employment and in jobs and in hope? And that is much less positive.
Yes. Well, on that cautionary note, thanks, Tony Leon. Thanks very much for your time. The book is Future Tense. I recommend you read it. That's all we have time for. Thanks for watching. I'm John Matisonn. See you next week.